Tonight we have with us a distinguished group of panelists who will in turn say a few words about their own work before we open up the conversation and then ask for comments and questions from the floor. The panel will be chaired by Dr. Amanda Williams, to my left, who along with Tanya Kaczynski, third on my left, and Arati Prasad here on my right, from our Science, Medicine, and Society Network, have principally been involved in the organizing of today's event. So I would like to thank them directly, and also while I'm at it, I'd like to thank Kate Hoyland from Global Health, and also Angela Hobart, who's sitting before me, a trustee of the Pseudosomal Trust, for their help and support in making this program possible. We of the UCL Science, Medicine, and Society Network are probably new to most of the people in this room, but we've been putting on public engagement events around themes of humanitarian interest to the public here at UCL and at the British Museum since 2006. So I really cannot conclude my brief comments without thanking UCL for helping to make this event possible through its Grant Challenge program. Now, Amanda will introduce the speakers, and she's also going to chair this panel. Amanda herself is a reader in clinical and occupational health psychology. She's well known for her work on pain, pain-related behavior, suffering, and torture. Amanda uniquely combines teaching, research, and clinical practice, and has been key to the organization of today's event, both the film and the panel, and will, as I said, introduce our guests before they speak. As the idea of tonight's event is to engage in conversation, we've asked each of our panelists to just say a few words about their work so you know who they are and why they're here. We would therefore like to ask the audience, if you don't mind, to hold your questions until we've allowed them each to introduce themselves. So first of all, please join me in welcoming our panelists. Now, before I turn pass the microphone to Amanda, I'd like to invite Professor Angela Hobart, who's sitting in front of me, to stand up if she doesn't mind. And Angela is an anthropologist and colleague of ours and therapist at the Helen Bamber Foundation. She's on the board of the Pseudosomal Trust, which is supporting Tanya in her artwork with survivors of torture. And I've invited Angela just to say a few words before turning the discussion over to Amanda and our panelists. Angela, please. Sorry, you'll have to hold this. I'm afraid we don't have a
well, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see such a big group of people here. And I first just wanted to say a quick thank you first to David Napier, who is the director of the Science, Medical, and Social Network, because this is really an outpost from it. And it's connected to the Lancet Commission. And I think it's absolutely crucial that we're having a meeting like this, a discussion, on, in fact, a very problematic theme. And this panel, and everyone I think who's here, we're joining in people from a lot of different disciplines, which I think is very important. Obviously the carers, the health carers, the doctors, the therapists, but there are also people coming in from the legal side, from policymakers, also very crucial. And I think the press is very important too, because they help disseminate knowledge about this. And as such, it's a unique opportunity for us to get together and to discuss this issue of people who've been tortured, who've been misplaced, who have actually very little voices. And as David pointed out, with government cuts, it's becoming, their situation is becoming ever more dismal. And I don't think many of the people who are in London, I don't know about the people who are in the audience, know that much about the dismal and dark sides, the spheres of of what goes on in London in the immigration and in the asylum seekers. But they are very vulnerable people. The benefits are so dismal. The way they live, the detention centers, but the panel will be talking more about that afterwards. I see it as a therapist who's been working with Pacific clients. And I think the whole subject is geared to bringing more welfare, more healing to actually our society too, so that they can engage with greater ease with these very, very vulnerable people, survivors of torture, who have been called scoundrels, outlaws, homeless, degraded, and who I think they're very controversial views about their place in the society, and it needs a great deal of joint effort to actually help these people and to bring them stability. And that's where I think this conference has also brought in the whole art side. And I think you've seen some of these wonderful paintings that survivors of torture have done. And I think Tanya has done a great job in working with survivors of torture, as actually their pictures indicate. And I just wanted also to say, I think it's quite important on the art side to bring in the pioneer, actually, to this work, Helen Bamber. And I worked in her association when she was still at Kentish Town. And then I followed her, actually, when she was working at the Institute for Freedom of Torture. And I think I just left after you left, Sheila. And now I'm at the Helen Bamber Foundation. And I don't know how many of you know that she was a great supporter of the arts herself. And I'll just give you this little quote from her. She stressed the healing potential of pop art and painting. Of one of her patients who survived, Helen Bamber wrote, "He built an entire castle, brick by brick, in the imagination, and thus retained his dignity and was not reduced to wretchedness." And I think that's all of those who are in the therapy side, which of course I am, there are many different types of therapy, seek somehow to give these very, very vulnerable people stability. And then I just want to add as my last point from my own experience, I have met such remarkable people under the clients that these foundations take care of. And they have great dignity, and they have been so degraded. Their stories are really quite appalling at times, that I think we should talk and listen and be together in a shared space in which we not only focus with mind, with cognition, but also with the heart, bringing in heart and mind into a very, very complicated and tricky area, but somewhere there's a lot of beauty in it too, if one can tap it. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a fantastic lineup, and I'm going to ask them to speak each quite briefly, so there'll be lots of time for discussion. Next to me is Megan Clement, who is Deputy Editor of The Conversation. If you don't know about it, look it up online. And she's recipient of the Australian Human Rights Award for her work on asylum seekers. She'll give an overview of the condition of asylum seekers and immigration detention in Australia. At the far end, we have Ewan Macmillan from the Justice Alliance, an expert witness and trustee of Kent Refugee Help. He'll talk about UK detention, the marginalisation of asylum seekers in the UK, and the role of particular groups in recovery. Then, in 1, 2, 3, 4, along from me, we have Cornelius Cotona, who is Medical Director of the Helen Bamber Foundation and also works at the UCL Mental Health Sciences Unit, who will give a medical perspective on the effects of detention and torture, and particularly about the complexity of trauma and the psychological responses to it. Then, at the far end next to Ewan, we have Sheila Melzak, who's Consultant Child and Adolescent Psychotherapist and Clinical Director at the Baobab Centre for Young Survivors in Exile. She'll talk about the invisibility of the needs of young survivors of human rights abuses and issues specific to children. Then, 3 along from me, we have Perico Rodriguez, who is a former political prisoner and now a therapist at Freedom from Torture, and he'll talk about the broader picture, the ideology of torture, and how myths around it serve to exempt our society of its responsibility for the fight against human rights violations. And then, last but not least, Tanya Kaczynski, who is an art therapist working in education and the former art therapist at Freedom from Torture's Open Art Studio, and so responsible for the exhibition. She'll speak about the importance of community, stability and continuity for asylum seekers and refugees who've experienced torture, and about her experiences of working with them in art. Thank you very much. Megan, can I hand over to you? I'm just going
We do have a decent microphone.
They get picked up with your notes. Well, you were with mine. I think mine might have been under your after I start. While I'm retrieving my notes, can I be heard if I don't use the microphone?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Something like a booming Australian accent to get us going. Thank you very much. Okay. So I've been asked here to come and talk about the situation that asylum seekers are faced with when they head towards Australia. This is something that has changed a lot, even since the work that I did, that Amanda mentioned, that was in 2012. We've seen a change in government since then, and for these people who are surviving torture, things can have only got much, much worse. I mean, what I'm really about to tell you is pretty much an asylum seeker immigration detention horror story that is currently playing out. Not even in Australia, but in the Pacific Islands surrounding it. So it almost goes without saying here that refugees and asylum seekers everywhere are people who are fleeing torture because of their ethnic background, religious beliefs, or political activism. Millions and millions of people are fleeing torture every day. But in Australia, torture is really something that happens somewhere else. And instead of thinking of asylum seekers as people who are fleeing torture, the prevailing view in Australia is that asylum seekers are people who come. One distinction remains very important in this calculus, and that is that we think of asylum seekers as people who come by boat. Whoops. Whoops. Sorry. So this is what you see when you go to the Australian Immigration Department website and click on refugees. Boat, no way, not going to happen. So Australian policy is pretty straightforward. If you travel to Australia by boat without a visa, you will not end up in Australia, and you will go for processing to Nauru or Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. These are tiny islands off the north coast of Australia. And it's not just on websites that we tell people this. This rather confronting photograph is the site of a suicide bomb attack in Quetta, Afghanistan. And the colour section at the top is an ad placed on a billboard in Quetta by the Australian government. It says, "All the legal routes to Australia are closed to Afghans." This is an image from an Australian newspaper. It says, "If you come here by boat without a visa, you won't be settled in Australia," which is a really useful message for all the asylum seekers in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and Iran who are reading the Melbourne Herald Sun in English. And I think this image really shows that what we do with asylum seekers has nothing to do with the asylum seekers who are coming, and everything to do with the people who read the tabloids. And these campaigns are all very well good, but there are two things that they don't acknowledge. The first is that people from Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and Sri Lanka are routinely denied visas that would enable them to arrive in Australia legitimately by air. The second is that most asylum seekers who come to Australia don't know where they're going. In Australia, we talk a lot about pull factors. We're the lucky country. People want to come here and get in on this amazing way of life. The truth is that from Quetta, Afghanistan, your family pays a people smuggler. They take you over the border to Pakistan. You're in Pakistan for a year maybe. Finally, you get a plane to Indonesia. Once you get to Indonesia, they take your documents off you. They put you in a room. You sit there. Could be a month, could be 2 months, could be half a year. And then in the middle of the night, you are shepherded onto a boat that is leaky and you don't know where that boat is going. Most people on the boats to Australia do not know they are going to Australia. But the truly shocking thing that happens to people who flee torture and end up in Australian custody is actually what happens when we get hold of them. Australian policy dictates that these people cannot be processed on shore, and they cannot jump the queue ahead of other legal refugee applicants. Now, we know that they can't do that, so we send them to Nauru and Manus Island. Papua New Guinea is one of the poorest countries in the world, by the way. What happens when we get there? The best case scenario, that's an Australian refugee camp. The best case scenario is that detainees face ongoing uncertainty and reduced control of their future, limited access to legal resources, and proximity to others exhibiting significant levels of psychological distress, otherwise known as the trauma that they are feeling is compounded by the situation that we then put them in. This applies not just to adults but to children. There are currently 1,000 children in detention on Manus Island, Christmas Island, and Nauru in Australia. That's a picture drawn by a refugee child in Australia in detention. The Australian is the blonde, happy person outside the jail, and the child is inside the jail crying. I just want to end with this quote because, and you can see what it says, the ones who are not physically injured are suffering from horrific post-traumatic stress symptoms. They can't sleep, and when they do sleep, they jump up screaming due to fear of another attack. Even now, days after, there is a strong possibility of another one as the locals stand behind the fence and make gestures to the effect that they will cut our throats and kill us. That is a quote not from Afghanistan, not from Sri Lanka, not from Iran or Iraq. That's a quote from an Australian detention centre in Manus Island, where there was recently a riot. 60 people were injured, and 1 person was killed. That's Reza Barati. He was killed from multiple blows to the head and being dragged down a flight of stairs. So, who cares for the survivors of torture in Australia? Not the government, that much is clear. Not the Papua New Guinean forces entrusted with their care, or the local citizens, or the militias who break into detention centres and assault them. Does the opposition care in Australia? No, they don't. This is a bipartisan policy to process people offshore. And this hasn't always been the case. There is another way. In the 1970s, there was a large wave of refugees to Australia from Vietnam. These people were treated, they came on boats, but we weren't scared. They were treated compassionately, and the Vietnamese community is one of the strongest, most vibrant in Australia now. What does this tell us? It tells us that Australians do not even care about survivors of torture, never mind for survivors of torture. If we cared about survivors of torture, we would not let this happen. The majority of Australian voters are not interested in what forces people to flee, nor what happens to them when they arrive in Australian waters. This, for me, more than any policy I've seen anywhere, shows the danger of apathy when it comes to those who have suffered most.
I just wanted to focus on two aspects of the art produced by people who've, to use Richard Malika's phrase, who've made the lonely journey through the land of violence. I'd like to focus on the aspect of this particular type of art, if I may call it that, which has the capability to transform the consensus at the center of society, because although very often the people who make this art are marginalized in all sorts of ways by the solitude of their journey, they are able, for some mysterious reason, in my opinion, to produce art that can shift consensus in some very strange ways. So I know very often we think of the art of survival violence as being, in some sense, therapeutic, and of course it is. But I do believe that it also has this other very powerful sacral function. I'm not going to say very much about the people who produce these particular pieces, because there's very little information is available. I can tell you what little I know, but I do know that all these pieces are, as David would call it, they're apotropaic. They're pieces that are intended to stave off violence and protect, and by the process of bringing violence into the mind of the person who creates it and the person who views it, they neutralize it and create a certain community of viewer and creator that is valuable in the processes of healing society and also of healing the individual who's created it. I think, other than that, in the very brief time available, I will leave this. And can I make that a little bit larger? Because this is one piece of refugee art, which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, but you may not know its trajectory since 1937 and 1938 through Paris, Madrid, and New York, and the effects it has had on political developments in those three societies. It is, of course, Guernica, and it was produced in 1938 as a response by a refugee to the violence in his country of origin. I think it raises all sorts of questions about how we, as people who have not made the journey that he made, and that the people who produced those masks have made, how we should engage with these people, how we can perhaps produce mechanisms that facilitate their journey through the central institutions of the societies that pretend to protect them, through the court system, through the detention system in this country, how we can facilitate the process of providing context again, because very often works of art of this type, as I call it, are intended to produce again a context that people have lost. And we can all do this in different ways. I'm working at the moment with UCL on the production of a medical legal database that enables doctors and psychiatrists and lawyers to, indeed, and survivors of violence to explain to the courts that what happened to them has parallels. There are case histories that can be compared. This is a very important forensic fact. And similarly, I think that Guernica's trajectory has triggered over 80 years, some really remarkable responses from within society. I think it's appropriate to begin with an eyewitness account of what actually happened in February 1937. The air was alive with the cries of the wounded. I saw a man crawling down the street, dragging his broken legs. Pieces of people and animals were lying everywhere. In the wreckage there was a young woman. I could not take my eyes off her. Bones stuck through her dress. Her head was twisted around her neck. She lay, mouth open, her tongue hanging out. I vomited and lost consciousness. By contrast, the Wolfgang Freiherr von Richthofen, the German officer who coordinated the attack on Guernica, said very succinctly, most inhabitants were away because of a holiday. A majority of the rest left the town immediately before the onslaught. So you have two narratives that the accounts of survivors of violence and the art they produce can address. And I remember when I first began in the late 90s reading the accounts of asylum seekers in this country, I remember my first impression was that I was reading Dostoevsky. I thought, this is astonishing literature. It comes from somewhere in the collective consciousness of humanity, and it needs to be read because it has a very important effect on society. When the painter was confronted with a German officer in Paris in exile who said, did you do this? The painter, Picasso, replied, no, you did. And I thought that it shows the succinctness of his verbal imagination as well as his mind. He often said that art is an instrument of war, and I'll just conclude by saying that after Picasso's death, because Nelson Rockefeller was unable to buy this piece from him, it was redone as a tapestry and held and put up in the gate to the Security Council in the United Nations. And when the war on Iraq was declared, and when Colin Powell and the British-born John Negroponte, the US ambassador to the Security Council, to the United Nations, were arguing for the attack on Iraq, they suddenly realized they had to make it, the speech, they had to make the case to the European powers and to the world in front of this painting. So they covered it. Of course the international press interrogated them on this. So why are you covering the painting? This is about violence, what are you suggesting? And they of course had no answer, but one indiscreet Moroccan aide to the Secretary General of the time said, well, the problem is the horse. Specifically, the horse's arse. Because it seems that they could not address the other images of suffering in the painting. They could only think of it in terms of a precise relationship between the lies being told in front of the painting and that particular detail. In conclusion, I can say that the capacity for these works of art to transform consensus is very important now, because in my opinion, we are seeing that we're in the early stages of the formation of a new kind of empire. It is essentially an empire of subcontractors to government, transnational corporate subcontractors to government, with limited liability and very little accountability. Always with very strong connections with the military and with intelligence, if you look a little below the surface. And it's really only through such means that one can be made aware of this. I think that's all I have to say.
I'm Colin Iskatona. I'm a psychiatrist by trade. I'm medical director at the Helen Bamber Foundation. What I'd like to do is spend my 5 minutes of a lot of time telling you a little bit about the work we do and the client group we see. Helen Bamber's already been mentioned a couple of times this evening, and this is not surprising. Her career in the field of addressing the needs of victims of human rights abuse goes back to 1945, so nearly 70 years, when she was one of the first people to go into the newly liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And one of the things that people forget about Bergen-Belsen is that it was transformed effectively from being a concentration camp to being a rehabilitation camp, because there was nowhere for a lot of the survivors to go. And so enabling them to become well enough to go and finding places for them safely to go was a piece of work that lasted many years, and Helen was involved in that for a couple of years. She also saw at Bergen-Belsen a lot of people who were beyond much conventional help, and I remember a conversation I had with her not very long ago in which she was telling me about some of these people for whom there were only really two things that could be done. She could hold them and she could bear witness. She could promise to tell their tale so that their tale wasn't forgotten. And the notion of bearing witness, the notion of documenting and carefully describing the torture experience so that that can be fitted into a legal argument and lest it happen again, is a very important notion. Now, at the Helen Bamber Foundation, we don't only deal with people who have survived tortures. We deal with a wide range of human rights abuses: state torture, other collective violence, human trafficking, trafficking for sexual exploitation and for labour, domestic violence, sexual violence, violence based on sexual orientation. And those may seem to be quite a disparate group, but what they have in common is that they have suffered intentional and repeated acts of both physical and psychological cruelty in a context in which they have been physically or psychologically entrapped. And the notion of entrapment, the notion that they remain entrapped even when physically they may have been freed, is also very important. So what are these people like? What are the commonalities between some of these people? They tend to be withdrawn, tearful. They often tend to be irritable and angry, and one of the stories that I hear time and time over is about the explosive expressions of anger that some of these people experience and display, which makes them, if you like, unlikable and difficult to help. Their appetite is poor, their sleep is poor, they have nightmares, often related, sometimes very directly, sometimes distantly to their experiences. They often hear voices. They often harm themselves as well as harming others by cutting, by head-banging, by taking bizarre risks, often sexual risks, with their own lives. And they have an overwhelming sense of mistrust. And one of the challenges that we have in dealing with them is addressing, acknowledging and working with that mistrust. They may say that they continue to be persecuted, and often we find that that's true. For example, people from Iran, people from Zimbabwe who tell stories about state actors from their home countries infiltrating the opposition political groups in which they play a part. And they often have huge difficulties in accessing treatment and care from a society, an organisation that has inbuilt hostility to them. The trauma that they have suffered is repeated, it's often complex, and what that brings with it is vulnerability to further trauma, and we often see these people exploited again and again and again despite their apparent freedom. We tend to see a common clinical presentation in which not only do they have post-traumatic stress disorder, but they show dissociative behaviour, they show the difficulties with trust that I've already talked about. They have a loss of agency, a loss of the ability to make decisions. I often talk about the difficulties that people like this have when they go into Starbucks. Would you like your coffee with caffeine, decaffeinated, would you like it small, medium or large? If they haven't got an intact memory of their past, they're unlikely to be able to imagine a future for themselves. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is we try and make a comprehensive assessment of their needs. And then we try and address those needs in an integrated way and in a way that allows what we call sustained recovery. And sustained recovery is a notion that recognises that these people remain vulnerable and new bad things tend to happen to them. And even when they seem to be functioning in a relatively intact way, it takes very little. It takes a bad piece of news from their home country. It takes a bad piece of news in terms of their immigration case to tip them over into a decompensated, non-functioning state. We try for these people, we try and offer legal protection, and the main instrument we have is the writing of specialist medico-legal reports, which are the particular way we have of bearing witness to their story, of telling their story in a way that is understandable, that tells their story succinctly in a way that they often find difficult to do. We also, as Angela has already mentioned, we have a range of both individual and group therapies, a creative arts program including a lot of art-related activities, and I'm going to close with the words that she wrote for a book called 99 Words, in which people were asked to summarise what they did and what they cared about in a very small paragraph. So this is what Helen wrote. People often ask me why I've spent most of my life concerned with the consequences of conflict and violence. The simple answer is, why not? The honest answer is more difficult. It's about the suffering of refugees. It's about the short life of compassion, how quickly it is born, how quickly it dies. It's about the stranger to whom we owe nothing. It's how our society will be judged and how we discover our humanity. It is finding our reward through the eyes of those to whom we owe nothing. It is about love. Thank you.
So I'd like to just talk very briefly about context, the environment of the young people and the internal world of the young people. And think about the barriers and opportunities to the processes of mourning and development for young survivors of child-specific human rights abuses. What we notice about our population is that their development has stopped at the time when a series of traumatic experiences began. So they may be 15 years old, but emotionally functioning like an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old. Also for us, though all our young people suffer from what's called complex trauma, the key issue for us is mourning, problems in mourning, barriers to the mourning process, and loss of real people in your life, but also loss of who you are and loss of the potential to find who you are and to find your identity. I find it helpful to think about journeys that the young people do, and as you talked about, the first journey is the journey from a country where there are human rights abuses, where you may see your parents being killed, you may be imprisoned, you may be forced to become a child soldier, you may be abused sexually, you may be forced into trafficking for sexual purposes, for slavery. And then somebody may help you to make a journey where you're also abused. So we offer a wide range of interventions, including advocacy, preparing reports to support people through the asylum system, something I learned from Helen, psychotherapy, where young people whose identity is completely fragmented are helped over time to work towards integration. We have a social worker who offers support in accessing benefits, in accessing housing, in accessing education and healthcare. We have all kinds of therapeutic activities, arts-based activities, sports-based activities, holidays, residential therapeutic experiences, social activities. But the key, I think, to our work is substitute parenting and a long-term key work approach and continuity of care, and containment and holding. And I'd like to introduce you to the ideas of two people, Stan Cohen and somebody called Bruna Sue. Bruna Sue wrote a series of articles on human frailty, and Stan Cohen wrote about states of denial. And Bruna Sue just made 3 points which I think are relevant for us here today. First of all, we all protect ourselves in the face of painful experiences and unconsciously develop psychological defenses in order to avoid experiences of pain. Secondly, there's all kinds of social and political factors that impact on what we allow ourselves to think about. For example, foreign civilians in countries where the UK is engaged in war. And thirdly, I think to do this work, we really need to be aware that we're all capable of the very best and the very worst of human actions. And it's very hard to hold that in mind. Freud said, and if the perception of reality entails unpleasure, that perception, that is the truth, must be sacrificed. And in our work, day by day, we see the avoidance of truth. So I thought I'd just read you just a little bit about which are narratives of young people. And which really illustrates the complexity of the experience. This is Richard. Richard experienced interpersonal violence. He was trafficked in his country of origin and in the UK. They talk about bullying and what happens when you're bullied, and then they laugh. They think it's fun. People find it entertaining. They don't understand what it's like to be really bullied. Someone asking you for sex, and if you refuse, they beat you up and they force you to have sex with them. They hurt you and frighten you, and they're in control of your life, and you're helpless because at any time they could kill you. It takes a long time to find the words. If you have a real experience of being controlled like this, it's not so easy to talk. There are no words for what it feels like really to feel so helpless and trapped. So now, he says, I want to feel free and I want to be not controlled by anyone. I'm just going to show you a couple of children's drawings. This is a girl who was forced to be a child soldier, separated from her family. And after over a long period of time, she began to mourn. And the top of the picture, you see her memories of her life with lots of people, parents, family. And in the bottom picture, it's me not happy after the war. Many of her friends were killed. Many of her family were killed. And this is also a little boy who was forced to be a child soldier, forced at the age of 5 to have a gun and to shoot people. And I saw him when he was about 12, and he dreams about the men who made him take drugs and shoot a gun when he was 5. And I think that's a very vivid picture. I'm going to read you one last quote, and then I'm going to stop. All I would like is some stability. I have had no stability in the past years. When we meet people from the UKBA, I feel that they think we're rubbish. In court, I felt I was nothing, and when the worker from the housing provider tried to make me leave, even when I showed him the papers from the court, the papers that said he'd won, I felt I was nothing, that I was hanging by a thread. Most of the time, I feel as if I'm not living, just existing. I don't even want freedom. More important would be some peace of mind, without this ongoing fear and not being able to control my moods and memories and feelings. Thanks very much.
What a good English. I'm very, very envious of all of the people who have spoken before, because my English is not the best, but I got my watch here and the possibility to move my hand, because you cannot speak without moving your hand. I sometimes have regret. I decided to speak, made a very long title to my speech. But I felt it was very important to try to bring the problem of torture and all violation of human rights to our own responsibility. It's not just that the others are committing violation, but also from our side as well. And if you know that the torture is not just an act of a mass person, but it's a very well elaborated plan to elicit information and to destroy the political enemies. And the person who torture is not just one isolated rotten apple, but somebody who have a place to torture with a lot of facilities, and this place is surrounded by armed guards that are protecting the torturer, and these armed guards are inside a big barrack, and this barrack is protected by the civilian lawyers and newspapers who condone the use of torture to the enemy. So sometimes when you talk about this evil torture, you're getting away from the reality and your own responsibility, in which way you can stop this thing to happen. And I bring here as well the case of the terrorists who drop a bomb and kill people. And what's the difference between somebody in an airplane from the Air Force who drop bombs in a city and they have this collateral damage, killing people and things like that. And my discussion and my interest in that is because here we can pick up the pieces, we can help people rehabilitate from ever and ever again. But the reality is that until our society have a clear idea that the role that our society is playing in the world, if they're never going to stop it all, and we're going to have this, like this production belt for the factory, this machine that produce victims and we help them to, some of them to rehabilitate, without recognizing the immense capacity that people have to survive by their own possibility. For example, I came in 1979 after some years in prison. I'm always saying that the Medical Foundation, the Helen Bamba Foundation, the Freedom from Torture, for me started when I was in prison, because at that time the Amnesty Medical Action Group launched an urgent action for my health. And immediately after I came to this country, I met Helen, and all the histories, you know, everybody has spoken about Helen. She's a fantastic human being, very committed. But her commitment, it forced us, or invite us to be also committed, to understand the suffering of the people, not to be indifferent, to us actually to stand up and say, yes, I am my brother's keeper. Yes, I am going to do something for that. And it's not just in tearful action, but it's a very concerted action. We hear, for example, newspaper in this country, every time a newspaper have this wave of campaign against immigration, 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 people are beaten up somewhere in a pub or in the street. There is an influence. And the vote that people have gaining in the election is when who is the more anti-immigrant political party. And the problem is that there are a discussion that is not sentimental. There is a serious discussion about the movement of people all over the world. In this very moment, according to the United Nations figure, there are more or less 250, 300 people, million people who are not living in their own country at the moment. Not all of them, of course, are refugees, are people who are moving for a number of different reasons. And this is the contradiction. People who go for good to Australia or United States are praised by people because they are doing well. But if somebody goes to Australia or United States or any other country claiming political asylum, they are not. They are very badly welcome or no welcome at all. Here in this country, the situation is exactly the same, because people have been put in prison for incredible reason, and sometimes they are released for the same incredible release reason that have been in prison. There is not a very strict code of practice for those people. It's so arbitrary, and that is the violation that Cornelius was mentioning. These people who have been tortured and live with the anguish, the fear, not knowing what's going to be tomorrow. And sometimes not therapy could be meaningful if somebody is in fear of their life or is in fear of their own family. We have, for example, we work at Freedom from Torture with a large Tamil population. And it's very interesting because in a way the Tamil population paid very heavily in 2009, but still paying. And yes, last year Cameron went to Sri Lanka and barred a lot of things, blah, blah, blah. But still, the government still is being supported, not condemned by no country, not even the United Nations. And those people who are suffering there are the people who are our clients, are the people who we have to pick up when it's not necessary, because they have the capacity to organize themselves. And I would like to refer, before I finish, about the Latin American, the Chilean, and the Argentinian community. When we came here, we came in very bad shape, but we have a lot of solidarity from many people, from the British people. And we were able to organize ourselves, to organize in community. We were able to attend the United Nations. We were able to influence most of the international conventions that are now accepted by the work of the Latin American diaspora. And this is very important. We were very welcome here. There were a lot of committed people around, and it's happening with the Vietnamese as well. The rest of the people are not welcome. And it's not by accident that those people are still suffering the problem that they brought with them together. And until we do not realize that, we won't be able to have a free world that we need in order to have a population healthy mentally and physical. Because this is the aim of all these organizations, human rights, that are dealing with a tremendous, awful violation of human rights. And this is our commitment. I think I'm so good about that because I run out of English immediately.
We do that. Clients, asylum seekers or artists, I'm never quite sure how to define them, but they would come every week and stay throughout the day to paint, talk and share trials and tribulations of daily life. Most had never painted before. It was so much more than a 50-minute hour, so popular with therapists. It was a day of therapeutic, social and creative endeavour. It was a place of much laughter and joy that came from the energy created by art making socially. And that's really what I want to focus on. Verbal language took second place, as so many different languages are spoken at once. People came from the four corners of the world, from Iran, Afghanistan, Dominican Republic of Congo, Sri Lanka, the Ivory Coast. This international therapeutic art school was proof itself of the universal nature of torture and how it is a continuous international problem, an issue for all humankind. The aftermath of war remains with all of us and is carried by these people who once, like us, had families, jobs, homes, and the nuts and bolts of everyday life. The last exhibition we had was titled £36, which is what asylum seekers live on per week in vouchers. They're not allowed to work, study, or do voluntary work. In short, become integrated in our society. They remain like ghosts in our machine, a lonely limbo hinterland. This process of seeking asylum can take anywhere between 2 and 10 years. So this is to put the studio in context of their lives. The clients had not only endured prison, rape and torture, they continued to live lives of isolation, fear of detention and deportation. So to come and paint these amazing pictures is a triumph of the spirit. Where are we up to? The lure of the studio is that it was a place not only that offered friendship, camaraderie and acceptance of all emotional states. It was a place that harnessed the universal power of imagination, the only true place of freedom. Art making is so much more than the reductive idea that it makes you feel better. It is a direct line to the unconscious, to our dreams and nightmares. And at the Open Art Studio, we travelled this journey together. Art making can be an intensely emotional and spiritual endeavour. It reveals aspects of ourselves and our histories that can be terrifying. Yet, when done in a secure and welcoming environment, can be an enlightening and cathartic experience. The nightmares have a forum. The studio provided a canvas for the unspeakable. In addition to making art, the studio provided a community where normal life was lived, if only for one day a week. We met as equals, we met as artists, not only therapists and clients. And everybody brought something to the table, whether it was flowers or cakes or practical exchange of ideas and information on how best to survive on £36 a week. Which churches gave food parcels, how to approach NAS officials, and other artistic and technical advice. Without the art making, it would have been a very depressing atmosphere. And yet, when we made art together, the irons in the room changed, like how an atmosphere can change when a piece of music is played. This time we were the performers and the audience. The process of art making is about many things, but at the studio it was about connections, to oneself and to others, the very thing they lacked in their daily lives. If an individual can connect with their internal world and manifest it outside on the canvas, a huge leap of faith has been taken. It is a timeless and universal need to say, I am here, or in fact, I am still here. From the Lascaux caves to street graffiti, it is a human need to make a mark, to confirm one's existence, especially when it is so fragile. So this group, more than any other, needs a voice, be it pictorial or verbal, a canvas for the unspeakable. Often, clients would talk of feeling dead. We live, but we are dead. Art allows for another existence to emerge, a reminder that despite everything, we can feel, process, and create. Art is a great leveller, and all who came to the studio made art, including Furico here on my left.
Very good.
You were very good. This provided a very democratic environment, and for people who have no agency and who are surviving from being totally powerless and have no sense of belonging, this sense of belonging and equality was vital. Let us imagine for 1 minute how it might feel after escaping prison and torture, enduring dangerous journeys, often not knowing if your children are alive or dead, being far from family and friends, not speaking the language, existing in a punitive system that doesn't allow you to work, sitting alone in a room provided by NAS on the outskirts of town with no friends or family and living on £36 a week, and facing the covert and overt xenophobia when the man on the streets thinks you've come here to take his job. So with all that in mind, a therapeutic art studio that provides a beacon of warmth and normal interaction was for many a lifeline. At the studio, just been given a time check, sorry, I'll do this very quickly. At the studio, people cared for each other, and when one client from Afghanistan was held in detention, we would phone the Altswood every Thursday, and I would pass the phone around the room for people to give their words of support and encouragement. We would send parcels of art materials and chocolate and soap. And like all prisoners, you're treated better by the people on the inside if they know there are people on the outside that care for you. Yet the level of desperation and poverty was and is extreme. People become destitute very quickly. They live in parks, in bus shelters. Their lives are fragile, fearful, and lack purpose and meaning, which is why art making in a social environment is so very important. I hope you take time afterwards to have a look at the little display that we have outside of paintings and artwork done by clients at the Open Art Studio, and also to take time to listen to a piece of oral installation that my colleague made when he visited detention centres in Europe. One final thing, due to cuts and reconstruction at restructuring at Freedom from Torture, the studio is currently closed, and it is my passion and responsibility to find an alternative venue. So if anybody has any connections or interest in that direction, I'd be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Any questions or comments from the audience? If it's a question, please say who you would like to answer it. And we do have a roving mic. There is someone over the other side. Ah.
Someone ready?
Who put a hand up over there? No?
Seriously.
Okay. In the front.
I don't think I need a mic.
Yeah, well, they can't.
Oh, I see. Okay, I do need a mic. First of all, I'd like to congratulate and think what the panel and their organisations are doing just cannot be better. It's fantastic. It's absolutely marvellous. My sad thing is not what they're doing, but what the government isn't doing and making it more even difficult for them. And that is not allowing them to earn any money or even to do charity work or to just to be somebody who can contribute to the government, to the where they're living. I myself, with my parents, were refugees from Nazi Germany, and the one thing that we were allowed to do, and in fact it was a stipulation, was that we and my parents were allowed to work and earn a living, and that helped them get over the terrible problems that they had. Besides talking to their own communities about it. And it really is so important, in my opinion, for the government to try and help these people, not financially. It'll help the government if they're allowed to work and pay taxes. You know, just unbelievable that they have this stipulation that they're not allowed to work. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Any comments from the panel, or should we take another question?
Question for Megan. My name is David Jones and I'm a policy officer at the Alarmingly Foundation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that every person has the right to seek and enjoy asylum. How does Australia manage to maintain any form of moral high ground, given that it is in breach of this fundamental piece of international legislation?
Well, I'm sort of flattered that you think Australia has any moral high ground
It was a rhetorical
on this
question.
issue. No, Australia is constantly under scrutiny for this very reason. The president of the Human Rights Commission in Australia was recently on Christmas Island and said she was shocked and appalled, particularly by the conditions that the children were facing. And UNHCR has told Prime Minister Tony Abbott that his policy of towing back boats to Indonesia, if they are seaworthy, is in breach of the convention. We've been in breach of the convention, I think, since 2001, and that's just how it is. I can't give you a more satisfactory answer than that, other than to say that the domestic political point scoring is far more important in Australia than upholding our international obligations.
Thank you.
It's a question for the whole panel, and again, thank you for your talks, which were excellent and very moving. My question is around nomenclature. I noticed a gentleman at the front whose name I missed described himself and his family as refugees, and yet we use the word asylum seeker. I wonder if there's a role for attempting to reclaim the language around this entire situation, and that we're being sucked into using the wrong words, and that might be part of reclaiming and regaining some traction on changing things. And the second is a suggestion that, having seen recently a BBC Panorama programme about corruption in the NHS, there was then a Twitter attempt to counter that with corruption isn't the problem, privatisation is the problem. I wonder whether there could be a coordination of groups working in this area to attempt to push against media stories that demonise migration in general and specifically portray asylum seekers, and whether there could be some overarching group that attempts every time there's a denigrating or destructive story in the media to actually push against that, so it's sort of ready and can push back immediately. Anyway, that's a suggestion. The first is a question around language. Thank you.
Can I just briefly address the asylum seeker refugee issue, at least in the Australian context? It's very important that the people that I was talking about are deemed asylum seekers, even though sort of 90% of them are deemed to be refugees. Because they haven't been deemed to be refugees yet is the reason that we give for keeping them in indefinite detention. So that's the differential there.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I think this question of reclaiming language is very important. And I think there's an important distinction that's not understood in this country between the way in which common law jurisdictions respond to asylum seekers and refugees and the way that the response evolves in Europe. There was a very telling exchange between David Blanquet and I think his name was Eric Besson. He was the French Minister of Immigration at the time, and he said to Blanquet, you know, in the land of habeas corpus, how on earth do you manage to get away with detaining people indefinitely? And history doesn't really record, or the press doesn't record Blanquet's reply, but I think we can assume that he said something about administrative detention. In the English-speaking world, in the common law jurisdictions, asylum seekers may be detained indefinitely because that's what the privatized profit model requires. I mean, on the European continent, with the exception of the Netherlands, detention is not privatized. And there is a European directive that limits the period of detention. I've looked at the subject in France quite a lot. I lived in France in 2007, specifically with the intention of understanding how it worked in France. And I noticed the same sensitivity towards language. The French go into complete sort of conniptions if you mention the word deportation, whereas here we make this distinction between deportation, which is only applies to people with criminal convictions, however trivial or contrived those criminal convictions may be, and removal. So in France, you can never say deportation. You can say éloignement du pays, you know, removal from the country, but you must never say deportation, even if it applies to criminals, because it reminds people of Nazism. And I'd just like to also return to the question that the gentleman in the front raised, which is this question of the continuity of refugee or asylum seeker perspectives. I do think this is very important, and over the generations this should be acknowledged. I very often think of how Britain responded to people flying from fascism in the 1930s. And I know from experience in London, in my house, that the perspective of people from that generation is important in shaping the sense of security that new asylum seekers and refugees coming into the country feel, very often looking for the elders they've lost in countries of origin. And I think much more should be made of this question of the continuity of refugee experience, because we tend to look at it in very atomized ways, whether we're looking at the difference in Australia and the United Kingdom, or whether we're looking at the difference between a Muslim refugee from Iraq and an African refugee from sub-Saharan Africa. There is a communities of these perspectives that can be developed.
The very concept have changed and justify invasion to other countries on the name of human rights. It justifies so many different things. Now, I remember many years ago, Sheila and I, we were in a meeting in Camden Lock, in the Anne Frank tent, and we say we need to continue this kind of meeting because there is a problem in our society. In this very moment, probably all around the world, there might be 10 international conferences on human rights, there must be 10 international conferences on goodies. Here there are many meetings like that. We go into the meeting, the people who live far from central London will take the opportunity to go to a pub, and we are good people. But then it dilutes in our lives. The commitment is not just to sit here and to say, I want to do something. We have to influence the political parties. We have to be part of that. And that's what I was mentioning in the case of the Latin American, because when we were here, we were fighting for the democracy in Chile, in Argentina. We were fighting against the impunity in Chile and Argentina. Last year, I was able to attend a trial where the people who torture us were sitting in front of me, in front of the judge. And this was the work of the people who didn't stop fighting, because it happened 30 years ago. And we mustn't stop, but we have to take a stance, otherwise we're going to have these nice gatherings, the good people, good intention, but then the bad is always going to take over if we don't stand film. And I'm the red under the bed, I think.
Can I come in very briefly? I mean, I think one of the things that's come over, and it's something Perico said very eloquently in his talk, is that it was not always thus, and it's something you were saying as well, that there is a tradition internationally, and there is particularly a tradition in the UK of welcoming. And that's what I would argue we need to recapture. I tried this in a little sort of internal exercise within the foundation. We were trying to capture what our mission in a few words, and my attempt was that what we were trying to do was to make people be safe, to feel safe, and to be welcome. And it seems to me that the policy component is the be welcome. And that ought to be something that we can recapture in the way that we made people from South America and people from Vietnam and people from Nazi Germany, like my parents, feel welcome. And not everybody made them feel welcome, but there was a public spirit of welcoming. It has been done, it can be done again. And I think that the thing that it needs to be offset against is the very conscious and specific mechanisms of marginalisation, of which perhaps the most obvious example, which the last questioner mentioned, was this notion of criminalisation, the notion that we take people who come into this country seeking refuge, and as if by magic, and it really is almost by magic, we turn them into criminals. Why do we have to do that? Why can we not welcome them? And why is that not a message that most people in this room will share? It's something that can be spread.
What I can't understand is why the government doesn't allow people to work. It's beyond me.
We have several questions, several hands up, please.
Sorry.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, is there anybody from the government here?
I'm not from the government,
Okay.
unfortunately. It's a point that Perico made about keeping in mind our responsibility and how we all are kind of part of the system. And I know there's lots of, for me, what was important about what I did last year, that walk, was to try and actually really understand it and live with it and really try and make that connection. And it's really bloody hard to do actually, because it's so distant from my experience. But I guess I would like to ask all the panel actually what people could do tomorrow to get involved, to understand more, and to change these things that we're so, I guess, angry about, you know, or upset about, you know. So that's my question.
Could I take Chair's privilege and answer the question about what to do tomorrow? The answer is, outside the House of Parliament, 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock, there's a demonstration every Wednesday for Shaka Armour, who you heard about in the film, those of you who weren't there. He's a British citizen who has been cleared for release from Guantanamo, but remains there, on and off on hunger strike, being force-fed, and absolutely desperate. So most Wednesdays, 1 to 3, opposite the House of Parliament, wear orange if you can. We try to dress in the Guantanamo clothes.
My name is James Connell. I'm a lawyer for one of the 14 men who was transferred from the CIA in September of 2006 after they had tortured these men, transferred them to Guantanamo Bay. My client is very interested in rehabilitation, but we of course have the problem of that he's still being held by the country that was involved in his torture. But it did so happen that just about 2 months ago, he was given some watercolors and allowed to paint. And so my question is to Tanya. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of things that could be done right, and I don't know how to do any of them. But do you have any suggestions or words of wisdom for a current prisoner who has, you know, his first experience with pain?
That's an unusual question. I would say keep painting, keep working at it. Keep working through whatever he's trying to experience, what he has experienced and is experiencing. And I think you'll find some sense of freedom and liberation in that process. I mean, there's many ways to combat what we're talking about. One is the external political response, like John was asking earlier, what can we do? There's another internal response or internal responsibility that each individual has. And I think art making can allow you a sense of freedom, even if you're in prison.
I wanted to address the idea that we've got a tradition of welcoming people, because there's a racial or coloured dimension to all this that's built on colonialism and empire. And if you look at the pattern of refugees coming to this country, the reception has got worse the darker skinned they've become. You look at the first waves of East Europeans who were welcomed for all kinds of political reasons, but also because they were Europeans. Move on to the Latin Americans, then to the Middle East, and then to Asia, and finally to Africa. And you can see the colour is getting darker, and the reception is becoming more hostile, and that fits right into the kind of racist structure that we have within this society. It's the same kind of structure that C.L.R. James describes in the Caribbean, where there's a hierarchy of colour. And the setting up of refugees against the indigenous population is precisely the same model of setting up new Commonwealth immigrants to this country since the 1950s against the indigenous population and dividing and ruling in precisely the same way. So although it may not be consciously planned, it is actually a very consistent oppressive political system that they fit right into.
Any comments on that? If not, would you like to please?
Very quick comment. I mean, I can't disagree with that in general. Having said that, my individual experience is that asylum seekers from Albania, from the former Soviet Union, who are very pale, are disbelieved in exactly the same way today by exactly the same system. So there are exceptions, but they may be the exceptions that prove your rule.
It's the system that's changed. You see, they all get the same treatment within the system, but the system's got worse as the percentage of black people coming in has got higher. Plus, you know, globalisation and all the other things that are going on as well.
Last question.
Thank you very much for your wonderful insight and for sharing it with us. My question sort of resides in the space between the therapeutic encounter as described by the panel and the political collective aspect of this endeavor. How do you, in the clinical in the therapeutic encounter, how do you approach the issue of accountability and being heard? I mean, making art and telling of stories is one thing, but feeling that you're heard is another. And we all know that so much of the healing process depends on being heard. And so how do you go about the audience? Who is the audience? Where does the acknowledgement come from, or ideally would come from? And in terms of the link between that and accountability, I mean, a lot of the, at least Middle Eastern refugees who come here are coming for very different reasons than people who came from Nazi Germany. I mean, a lot of what's going on in the Middle East, the UK and the US have a role in creating those conditions. At least that's the perception by those people. So how do you approach accountability and the issue of being heard?
I think that sometimes what the first task to me is to help the person who are coming to our organization, is to help them to have a more coherent narrative. And because they came confused, everybody has spoken about the different society, the different environment. And it's funny because we, the Argentinians, sometimes we believe that are semi-European or something, that we qualify being European. But when I came here, I was very confused about London, and it was a situation that sometimes I'm thinking back, and I was confused in many respects. So that is one of the first things, to really bring the person to understand their own reality, the journey. Today a client of mine was telling me about the triangle of horror. And very interesting because he said home, journey, UK. This was the triangle for him. And when he going to connect with the last one, UK home. And because for the journey is very complicated, it's not just, let alone the torture, the political persecution, let alone everything that you have lost. The journey to come here is dangerous, is uncertain, is difficult. When you have arrived here, you might say you made it, you succeed, and yet you have the immigration there not trusting you. So we have to help them, those people. But sometimes even those people who are escaping, they're escaping in a sort of escapade, that they don't know very well what has happened to them or why. And we have to help them to bring to them the political context of the suffering.
Great. Well, this has been, I think you'll all agree, quite a remarkable evening. The French anthropologist and medical doctor Didier Besson once said something to the effect that our morality is only as consistent as is our ability to afford it. And I think that one of the things that comes through to me quite powerfully this evening is the sense of anxiety that all of us feel in seeing how malleable that morality actually can become when people feel, for whatever reason, destabilized or financially threatened. And the theme, therefore, of consistency, which I think emerged in almost every one of our speakers, the need for people to have some kind of sense that there is durability and endurance in people's mutuality and their commitments to one another, is something I think comes out quite powerfully in each of these remarkable presentations. So before we retire for drinks and viewing the paintings in the foyer, I first of all, of course, would like to thank our panelists and our chair, Amanda Williams, and also you, the audience, for staying with us and for this moving discussion. And I'd also then, on a rather more formal note, also like to thank UCL for their support, and to Ian Scott, who's there from the Grand Challenges, for helping to make this and so many of our initiatives possible, and also, of course, to Suda Soma Trust for concretely making it possible for the painters, some of whom are here in the audience, to create the wonderful things that we have the chance to see. So I won't say much more, except that I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists.